Today, I will be, of course, talking about the Roman Republic. Mostly, I'll talk about the Punic Wars today. I'll kind of get into that. Good chunk today, lecturing on that. What happened, because that's really the thing that really leads into the empire that kind of comes later, where the Romans start taking over the Mediterranean Sea. Now, kind of talk about the rise of all these different political kind of dictators that kind of take over Rome, like Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, Pompey, Marcus Crassus. You probably heard of Cornelius Sulla, Gaius Marius. We'll kind of get into some of these men. They're kind of why the Republic kind of eventually declines and, of course, becomes an empire. So anyway, from last lecture, of course, I think I talked about the background of Rome, like going back to the monarchy, kind of went into the Republic. Even kind of talked a little bit about the government they had, which I told you was kind of like a representative type democracy, but it was more like an oligarchy that they had. And then I did start talking about the Punic Wars. So that was one thing we did kind of get into, is we kind of had talked about that, at least some background into it, where we started discussing like I guess who was involved in it, obviously, with that, which I think I told you, it was just, you had two sides. You had the Roman Republic fighting at Rome versus the Carthaginian Empire. And you can see the wars lasted quite a while. I think I told you they were a series of 3 wars, right, that lasted from 241 to 146 BC. But they weren't fighting the whole time. It was like off and on wars that occurred between the 3rd and 2nd centuries. But in the end, what would happen, was that the Romans would win all 3. And they would wipe out the Carthaginians, take all their territory and all that. And I think we already talked about the Carthaginian state, right? It was a multinational or ethnic state, really, that was based in North Africa, founded by the Phoenicians a long time ago. Carthage, being the capital of it. I think I told you it was based in Tunisia today. Tunis is where the ruins of Carthage is today. But they're a multi-ethnic state based of like mostly North African peoples. And then later also some peoples in Europe like Spain. I think some of the Celts joined them for a while, believe it or not, fought alongside them and all that as allies, etc. Now, I didn't talk about the background of the different authors that wrote about the Punic Wars. I'll kind of talk a little bit about that, who was involved in that. Yeah, the main authors that write about the Punic Wars, you've got Livy, of course, who we've talked about before. He, of course, is considered one of the writers that really wrote about the Punic Wars. He's got a series of books. Well, I'll kind of put them on the screen here, all the ones that are the authors. But yeah, you got Livy, Polybius, and Appian. Those are the 3 that were the writers. Livy and Appian were like Roman writers, like in ancient times. Livy's writing about the time of Emperor Augustus. They put it about 2,000 years ago. Polybius is the oldest. He was a Greek writer. He's writing 2nd century BC during the Hellenistic age. So he's got one of the, older books that go back further than the other ones. And Appian's writing later. He's not as good, but Appian also was a Roman writer living around the time of like Emperor Trajan, probably like about 2nd century AD or CE. So much, much later, like way after the wars were actually fought. So that's why his is probably not as good, because it's like, written later, more or less. And here's the other. So you have Livy right there. And then you have the other ones, which the other 2 writers here, there are their different books that they wrote. Polybius has got a series of books called the Histories of Polybius, which of course were written, like I say, 2nd century BC. And then Appian's works are called usually Roman history as well. So those are all the different works that were really written about the Punic Wars that took place, of course, a long time ago. It's got a few more people joining us too, by the way. Ashley, hey, good morning. Hope you're doing great out there. And of course, Maya also as well. Hey, what's going on? If you want the okay, I'll put them on the screen. But these are actually the kind of the books right here if you want to look at them right here. But yeah, Appian is usually Historia Romana, I think is the Latin name they'll put it under. And with Levy's books, they usually put like books 2130. They're usually listed as the War with Hannibal, and all that, because that's, I think, mostly Levy just writes about just mostly the Second Punic War and some of the first one also as well. Now, I'll talk about the First Punic War. The First Punic War really wasn't, it's not as famous, compared to the other ones that they had. But obviously, the First Punic War is the war that started all the Punic Wars. Pretty much, you can see there's the Punic Wars, by the way. First Punic War, Second Punic War, and Third Punic War. They're not fought at the same time. You can see the First Punic War, by the way, was the longest of the three wars. Second one, by the way, was the bloodiest of three wars. The Punic Wars, by the way, are the bloodiest conflicts that were fought in ancient times. The amount of casualties, I believe, in the Punic Wars was, I forget the number exactly, but it's somewhere between 1 to 2 million people died during the Punic Wars. That's how bad it was. Up to medieval modern times, there's much wars worse than that they have. I think the so-called 100 Years' War was pretty bad. The 30 Years' War was pretty bad too, and more early modern times. But you can see they fought over different conflicts. One of the main things that caused the war to break out between both sides was the fact that both fought for control over what is Sicily, the island of Sicily. And if you remember correctly, they were talking about this video I showed you at the beginning where they kind of discussed that right here. And you can see in the map here that Rome's in Italy, you can see there, the Republic at the time. And then Carthage was based, you can see, mostly in those red areas. Carthaginians controlled like the western side of Sicily right here. And then on the eastern side, which is up here, there was a Greek colony or city-state there. It was called Syracuse, which was right here. They became an ally of the Romans because a lot of Greeks lived in southern Italy, in Sicily. In fact, the Greeks often called southern Italy, they called it Magna Graecia, which meant Great Greece, because of the Greek influences down there, all that. And so both of them wanted to take control of it. So, you had, the Romans wanting to take over Sicily to maybe get into North Africa. And then, of course, the Carthaginians wanting to take over Sicily so they could take over Italy. They can't get into Europe and all that. So got both these states, trying to, like I said, vie for control over the Mediterranean Sea at the time. What's the comparison with the powers at the time? Well, mostly the Romans were predominantly they were mostly a army type power. Like, so the Romans had like mostly land armies they had. But the Carthaginians relied more on their naval power, and also hired a lot of mercenaries, which they would do a lot. Even under Hannibal, had mercenaries, maybe 500 ships possibly as part of their naval power as a whole. I do got an image showing the map of Carthage, also like the actual what it looked like maybe right here. And possibly Carthage may have had these kind of like two ports to it, one for its merchant fleet and one for its naval power, navy, the Carthaginian Navy as well. Population may have been 250,000 at the time when they fought the initial beginning of the wars, but I think by the end of the wars, it was like up to like 500,000-600,000 range, believe it or not. This might be more of an image of maybe what the Roman city looked like later, because it was later a Roman Carthage. They kind of replaced it after they destroyed it in the so-called 2nd century, a little later. Like I said, the first Punic War was like mostly they fought on Sicily, like land battles and all that. But they did have like these naval battles that were fought during the war, which was true, where the Roman Navy fought the Carthaginian Navy, which was supposed to be more powerful. However, over time, what happened was the Romans actually developed their own navy during the war, and by the end of the war, they had like a better navy. Naval power, and the Romans would develop these different types of warships. Like I think the most famous was the quinquereme. They always talk about which was a type of vessel which had something like, I think it had like I think it was like 5 rows of like oars on it, I think, which was faster. And it was kind of a type of, galley ship that was warship that was copied from Carthaginian Phoenician designs, from a long time ago. And a lot of the Roman ships would have these boarding devices on them. I don't know if you heard about the so-called Roman corvus that was used in battle. It's spelled put on the screen, but it's called corvus, Corvus, which means, by the way, in Latin, crow or raven. And it had this boarding device, like a landing plank that was about 30, 40 feet long. And they would throw it down on the other ship. It had a spike on the end of it. It looked like a bird's beak, like a crow or raven's beak, I guess. Hold it in place, and then they would run across and take the ship, basically. And so pretty much that invention was supposedly something that helped them win naval battles. It was well known. And I think Polybius was the famous historical writer that wrote about it, about the use of that little kind of thing they had, that weapon. I guess kind of like a weapon, but not. But basically used it to turn the battles around for them eventually. By the end of the by the end of the First Punic War, what ended up happening was the Romans defeated the Carthaginians in Sicily, and of course at sea. And what ended up happening was the Romans would end up taking over Sicily. So they took control of Sicily, and then they would also kind of expand it here as well. They would also take control of what is Corsica, and also what is at Corsica, Elba, right here too, little island here close to Italy, and also Sardinia, and then Sicily. So all these areas will be here conquered by the Romans at the end of the First Punic War. And really, those are considered to be really Rome's first actual conquests that occur, outside of Italy, believe it or not. So that was the initial war that was fought, between the Carthaginians and the Romans. And they're going to go on to win all 3 of them. That's what's going to happen. Now, what happened between the wars? That's another thing too, as well. Well, between the wars, what happened was, if you go in this map here, right here again, one of the things that happened after the first war was the Carthaginians decided to cross over the Mediterranean Sea, and they began colonizing this area here. So it's just an area that was like, they called it different names. Hispania, I think, is one of the common names they called it. And they founded a city right here, you see here, called New Carthage, which, by the way, today that city is now called Cartagena. It's right here. So it was a famous, city in Spain. I think they called it New Carthage, I think was really what they called it, though. And the guy that helped found that, by the way, I'll put him on the screen. His name was Hamilcar Barca. And Hamilcar Barca was a famous Carthaginian general that had fought in the First Punic War. He was also the father of Hannibal, or Hannibal Barca, who would come later. And he helped to colonize that area and conquer it. And of course, after he died, what happened, if you know about it, was his son took over, Hannibal. And then Hannibal later, expanded the Punic Wars and took it to the Romans and all of that. And of course, they talked about how in that video, how Hannibal from a very young age swore that he would get revenge against the Romans for, I guess, the loss in the first war. I think after his father went to Spain, he kind of made that promise to his dad, and all of that. And so that's what would happen, of course, later with that. So that's the next thing, of course, we're going to get into, is talking more into the so-called Second Punic Wars that happens, of course, next. Anyway, we're going to talk about mostly Hannibal, for a while, who, by the way, Hannibal is considered to be, by the way, one of the greatest generals in world history. Really is. He's considered to be, by the way, the father of military strategy. He's one of the first real generals in history that used strategy in battle. He had kind of planned out ahead, like what he was going to do. So Hannibal basically was kind of like, it was almost like he was playing chess and they're playing checkers. It's really what it was. And he has been compared a lot with a lot of other generals in history. Napoleon, of course, is one that comes to mind. Obviously, Julius Caesar, maybe like George S. Patton, all these other great generals that have Scipio, Africanus, of course, famous Roman general. We'll talk about later. So one of the greatest military minds, in history, and people are still studying, their battles, their strategies, and all that, of course, today, more or less. So, and the Romans, by the way, were scared of Hannibal, like deeply so, which is true about it. There was an old Roman saying, which was Hannibal ad portas, which means in Latin, Hannibal's at the gates, which, by the way, was an old saying that sometimes parents or nursemaids or whatever would tell children, like if they were being bad, they wouldn't go to bed or whatever. They would say Hannibal was at the gates. Hannibal's going to get you if you don't go to bed. So Hannibal was like the boogeyman, really of the Romans. Kind of like Napoleon was the boogeyman of, I guess, the British during the Napoleonic Wars and all that. So that's often been compared, more or less. So he was hated and feared. Even when he's dead, they still feared him or feared another Hannibal was going to come back, get him. And he was the closest really to destroy Rome, I think, before maybe it was destroyed later. So let's get into the Punic Wars. Like I said, the Second Punic War is the bloodiest conflict, of course, ever fought. Like I said, during the Punic Wars, 1 to 2 million deaths may have occurred in probably all the Punic Wars, total most likely, down to the end. And what caused the war to break out? Like, why did the so-called Second Punic War break out? The reason for it, if you go back to that map I just showed you, of course, with, I guess, the region of Europe right there, you can see basically the fact that in that western part, you can see how this area here, they're starting to colonize, the Carthaginians. Well, they had a city here called Saguntum, which was on the Mediterranean coast here. And it was this, it was actually a Greek city. It had been founded years ago by the Greeks that were there. They called it Saguntians or something like that. And anyway, they were allied with the Romans and traded with the Romans. Hannibal didn't like that. He thought they should be allied with them, or that should be under, Carthaginian rule. And so what caused the war to break out was what happened was Hannibal basically laid siege to it in 219, like 219 BC, and eventually sacked their city. And so what happened was it caused basically the Romans to declare war on Hannibal. And the Romans thought that he was just going to stay there, in Spain or whatever, and they were just going to march over there and try to attack him or send their navy over there to attack him. Well, that's not what happened. If you know about that, Hannibal went on the offensive. And so that led to the so-called, second Punic War, of course, that would happen, next, where he would invade, of course, Italy. So with a huge army, maybe 50,000 troops, not sure the exact number, more or less, but they would basically involve infantry, you can see cavalry. And it's interesting about it, they think he brought over war elephants, which I forget the number exactly. He had 80 maybe or more, he brought with him. That's one thing he's known for, Hannibal. You saw the coin, where like coins with, of course, the elephants on it in battle. And war elephants, were beasts. They were kind of, like I said, tanks in ancient times. Of course, they could be unreliable. That's the only thing about them. They could just run off in one direction. So under great control, elephants were like terror weapons, really, against the enemy. And a lot of the one thing, of course, that Hannibal's known for, which is very famous, Hannibal is famous for crossing the Alps into Italy, in northern Italy. He's known for this, with this, like I said, this huge army, which nobody had ever really done that before. Napoleon's famous for that too. There's been paintings of that. Napoleon going through the Alps and all that, as you know. And his army comes down into the Po River Valley. If you go, think back to that map right here that I was just showing you. Actually, I've got another map. I guess I can kind of show you depicting the actual, I guess, route of Hannibal. Hannibal's route that he actually takes is it's actually kind of goes on this march here in green. So up the coast, through the Pyrenees, and then he crosses the Alps, Italian, French Alps here, and then into northern Italy. He fights like several battles against the Romans. The initial battles, I think he fights, I'll show you, is two of them they talked about in the video a little bit, which was the Battle of the Battle of Trebia was the first one in 218, and then of course you have also the Battle of Lake Trasimeno or Lake Trasimene, both fought in northern Italy. Both were total routs, by the way, of the Roman forces. Romans tried to put up their forces, and fight them in just head-on, attacks, like offensive battles. They kept getting crushed. The video, they said they took something like 100,000 casualties in just two battles. Just how bad it was. And there was this Roman general who said that that's not a good idea because the fact that Hannibal is such a good military tactician. His name was Fabius, Fabius the Delayer, or Fabius Maximus, they called him, of course. He said we ought to use guerrilla tactics instead, hit and run type tactics, where we try to, not fight him head to head, mano to mano. We're getting clobbered here. And of course, what happened was the Romans made fun of him. They said, "You're the delayer. You want to delay the inevitable. That we got to fight him. Head on in battles. Us Romans, we're not cowards. That kind of thing." They thought he was a coward. Of course, because of this. And so what happened was, as Hannibal's army marched southward, you can see down the coast, you can see the east coast of Italy, right here, like down the coast here. Like where the Adriatic Sea is. Well, the Romans decided to bring up a huge army to try and see if they could corner him and destroy his army. And so if you know about the Romans brought up a huge army, which actually in that video, it's a little bigger than that, they think. They said 70-something thousand or something like that, I believe what it was. But they think it may have been closer to 90,000 may have been the actual size of the army. It was actually about maybe 16 legions because half of it gets wiped out in the battle. It was so big, by the way, it had two generals, Gaius Vero, and of course the other general was another general named Lucius Paulus, who was there. Anyway, so they got this huge army, but Hannibal's got like a smaller army. His army is about 40,000. So you can understand why basically they would think that they could easily just corner this army and just destroy it. So that began the so-called Battle of Cannae, as they would call it, which is really considered to be Hannibal's greatest battle that he really fights in. Battle of Cannae. Anyway, what happened in the battle, Hannibal had a plan that he kind of created before the battle of what he was going to do. He knew that the Romans were more centered with their infantry in the middle, like the legionnaires. And so that's not a good map to show you what he did, but he put his army in a V formation with the center. It's kind of like a crescent formation that was like, it was either a crescent or a V formation, they say. It was more like, kind of lower that down a little bit, but it was more like a V formation like that, whereas infantry was more concaved in the middle. And so it basically welcomed the Romans to attack in that center right there. But what happened was he had this idea where he would try to encircle their forces on their flanks and their rears. And that's actually what ended up happening, using infantry, cavalry, and also pike infantry, which the Carthaginians were still using at that time, were able to encircle the Romans' forces, even though they had a smaller army, which is amazing itself. And so, about Cannae, it's considered one of the greatest encirclement battles in history, at least in ancient times. They call it the so-called double envelopment. And so you can see there how his forces were able to drive off basically the Roman cavalry. And then from there, in the form of like the cavalry and some pike infantry, I think it was too. They were able to encircle the whole force. And most of the army couldn't get out. They were trapped, basically, is what it was, in this huge vice. And so what ended up happening, his forces basically just destroyed, I think, more than half the army. I think something like, I want to say about 40, 50,000 were likely Romans were killed in the battle. That's how bad it was. So he wiped out like half the army or more. I think out of 16 legions, only 8, I think, survived the battle. That's how bad it was. So Cannae was considered to be one of Rome's worst defeats in their history, if you read about it. But the only thing about Cannae that was bad was that he took casualties too, trying to battle this huge army. And so his army really wasn't able to really finish the job, because I think from there he could have marched on Rome, right, and taken the city and all that. But he lacked the numbers. So he lacked the numbers, he lacked the siege equipment and all that. And so the only thing he really could do, if you know about it, was the so-called Second Punic War, would just drag on for years, a couple decades after that, for years and years. And so the Romans went back to that whole idea of what Fabius talked about, Fabius Maximus, who wanted to use guerrilla tactics or whatever. That's mostly what they did the rest of the time when they fought Hannibal in Italy. Yeah, Fabius, they say, is considered one of the fathers of guerrilla warfare, where it got started initially. So, but I think the term guerrilla is a term that they adopted later in Spain. It's a Spanish word. It means little war in Spanish. All right. So yeah, that's pretty much, so they'll say, like I said, the war's dragging on in Europe within Italy at the time. Now, there's going to be this other general we're going to talk about next, who's going to come in. He's got a different strategy, of course, that they're going to have, of course, to fight against the Romans. One of the things that the Romans start doing, of course, they come up with a different plan. Besides guerrilla warfare in Italy, the other thing that the strategy they come up with was to try and attack, Carthaginians and Hannibal's supply lines, which, go all the way into Spain, through France and all that. And then, of course, they want to attack also other parts of the Carthaginian Empire, like attack Spain, attack into North Africa. And so Scipio really is the general that will do that. And Scipio, by the way, is considered to be really one of the greatest generals that fought in the Punic Wars. He, of course, was known, by the way, sometimes as the Roman Hannibal. He was kind of like his equivalent overall, and would eventually go on to defeat him in 202 BC during the Second Punic War. So he's very, very important, and he is considered one of the greatest generals in ancient times that people also study. But it didn't start out well. If you know about it, I think he was at the Battle of Cannae and survived. By the way, the guy that did not was Lucius Paulus. He was killed in the battle. So yeah, one of the generals was killed, by the way, in the battle. But he was there too, Scipio. He was on the losing side. I think he learned a lot from that actual battle later against Hannibal. So what Scipio did, if you go to this map here, I was showing you earlier, he, of course, came up with the idea, like I said, to attack into Spain. So what the Romans did was they used their navy, the naval power, to cross the Mediterranean Sea here. And then where the Pyrenees is, they came down the coast here. So about 208, 206 BC, one of the things the Romans began doing was seizing that area. They thought that would get, Hannibal out of Italy. It didn't work. But Scipio does fight against Hannibal's brother. Hannibal had something like 3 brothers who were also kind of like commanders as well. And Hasdrubal, of course, he would fight him in Spain, defeat him by 206, and I think he was killed in battle, Hasdrubal. And so that would set up, later for the Romans to conquer and take over Spain at that point. And then after that, with that Spain, with Spain out the way, them being defeated there, the Carthaginians, you can see from Sicily what happened next. Scipio, using the navy as well, would eventually cross the Mediterranean Sea from Sicily to North Africa, try to attack into the heartland, of the Carthaginian Empire, and all that. And so that's going to lead eventually to a showdown, between Scipio and Hannibal, which will be in 202 BC. It's going to force basically Hannibal to come back to Africa, North Africa from Italy, leaves by ship. And it'll lead to a famous battle called the Battle of Zama, which was fought, they think, sometime in October of 202 BC. And of course, that battle, of course, is considered to be, by the way, one of the epic battles that was fought in ancient times. It's considered a very famous classical battle up there with Cannae as well. Anyway, kind of a little background about this battle. Zama's important, that battle. Of course, they talk about the Cannae more, I guess, more or less in the Punic Wars, but it is important. That battle will be important in neutralizing Hannibal, his military, and of course, allow eventually the Romans to not just keep possession of Spain, but eventually to neutralize the Carthaginians as much so that they could then eventually take over North Africa, which they will in the end. By the way, Zama is famous for something that's well known that people talk about sometimes. It's very famous for the two generals meeting each other, which they say that Hannibal was the one that wanted to meet Scipio. They two wanted Scipio wanted to meet Hannibal. That's what it was, actually. And Scipio was actually he liked Hannibal. He thought he liked his tactics and all that. And they kind of became friends somewhat. And but Hannibal refused to basically, I think Scipio wanted Hannibal to surrender his forces and all that in the war, but basically refused. Hannibal thought he had more forces, which it looks like he almost had 50,000 troops, and then Scipio had more closer to 40,000. So he had him outnumbered a little bit. And then Hannibal had his war elephants, also true as well. But the war elephants proved to be not very effective. The Romans eventually figure out, how to fight against war elephants. They eventually do. Like I could say, they could be unpredictable elephants. They just run off in one direction. And one thing that the Romans learned from fighting elephants is that when the elephants would attack them, what they figured out is they could part their legions, make room for them. They also used trumpets, I believe, to scare them, to make them run off or something like that. And so the elephants were not effective at all. In fact, some were actually forced behind the legions where they killed them. From there, what ended up happening was that Hannibal's forces suffered basically a rout with Scipio, and mostly due to cavalry. The fact that Scipio had learned, the importance of cavalry, heavy cavalry, and he was able to use his cavalry to encircle Hannibal's forces, like not just on the flanks, but in the rear. And so Hannibal ends up losing his whole army. Like half the army gets, I think, killed and wounded, and the other half gets basically captured. And so elephants in the end, are considered, obsolete after the Battle of Zama. So people don't really use them much after that. Maybe in India or somewhere they're using them, but they don't use them much in the Europe or Africa, much in warfare, too much overall. So what happened after the wars? Carthage was forced to pay high reparations. That's one thing, of course, that's going to occur to the Romans, to pay for damages in the war, like in Italy. And then, of course, Carthage is going to become a weaker power after the war. That's going to enable the Romans to eventually take over North Africa. And so that's something you're going to see later, of course, with the Third Punic War I'll get to today. What happened to Hannibal? Hannibal was in power after the war. I think Scipio and him were kind of friendly to each other a little bit, if you read about it. But he was eventually forced into exile because the Romans thought that that the Carthaginians were going to make a comeback. They didn't want him, of course, staying in power. So he was forced into exile eventually. And he ended up actually later, believe it or not, fighting for the Seleucid Empire when the Seleucids were fighting the Romans, like in Turkey and Syria and all that. But I think when he was like fighting them, he was almost going to get captured. And if you know about the story about this, Hannibal killed himself, they think around 183 BC. So anyway, so yeah, from the end, he I guess before he even killed himself, he hated the Romans to the last breath and all that. So that's the so-called Second Punic War, and of course Hannibal. Right, I'm going to next get into, of course, the other war they had. Of course, they had this other war they had that was fought later, which is the Third Punic War that came in. And the Third Punic War was one of these wars that was very decisive. It's pretty much not much of an outcome to it. Carthaginians kind of put up a fight, but it was no contest, pretty much. And yeah, it's a decisive victory where the Romans just destroyed Carthage and just conquered North Africa, which they would do. And it was all caused by the fact that the Romans feared that the Carthaginians were going to come back. There was going to be a resurgence. You know, they had paid off all their debts, the Romans, that they owed from the Second War. And then there was also this greed of the Roman Senate that they want their land. This is a not good, grand opportunity to seize all the land in North Africa, which I think you study about later about North Africa there. It was kind of a breadbasket. They grew a lot of crops there at the time. And there was this Roman senator you probably heard of named Marcus Cato. He's well known. He was a big backer of the war. And I don't know if you like my little, there's a little thing there, if I can show that right there, a little poem there, but it's rose are red, the legions are deployed, Carthage must be destroyed, which of course, is a famous saying that he was kind of known for. And who was Marcus Cato? Marcus Cato was this Roman senator who was a great speaker, a great orator, and he was known for being like also a lawyer, as like an attorney or something like that. And anyway, he was a war hawk. He thought the war ought to, be fought with the Carthaginians and finish them off. Anyway, he was famous for a saying, which he would say, which I'll put on the screen. But it was basically this: "Ceterum autem censeo Carthaginem esse delendum," which in Latin means, furthermore, I consider that Carthage must be destroyed. And apparently when he would be giving speeches in the Senate, it didn't matter what he was talking about. He could be talking about, we need to raise taxes, or we need to worry about garbage being picked up properly in the city, whatever there is, I guess they're talking about in the Senate, about the government and whatever. He would kind of make a statement at the end. Oh, by the way, something like that. Furthermore, I consider that Carthage must be destroyed, or something like that. So that became kind of the, I guess the famous quote and trademark, I guess, of basically the war. And it also makes a great shirt, by the way, which I'm wearing that shirt, by the way, right now. But anyway, so that's what egged them on, I guess, to want to fight. And I think what they say caused the war to break out. I'm trying to think it's in this map right here. You notice down there's a state called Numidia, where Carthage supposedly wanted to go to war with Numidia, which they're angry about. Some kind of North African state that was there. Numidia was an ally of the Romans, and so the Romans kind of used that as an excuse to basically attack them. And so it was like a preemptive war, more or less, is what it was. And so what happened was the Romans, launched an attack there into it. And eventually, what ends up happening, of course, is that the Romans would eventually lay siege to it. So it leads to a long siege, which lasts something like 3 years, like 149 to 146 BC. The Romans, lay siege to it, the city of Carthage. The Romans would surrender. In fact, they tried to fortify it more. And eventually, soldiers, armies that were under Scipio Aemilianus, you see on the bottom, who was like a grandson of Scipio, was the one that eventually sacked and destroyed it. And most of the city, by the way, was destroyed. There's, of course, a lot of different pictures, I guess, they have of Carthage today, but pretty much it was burned to the ground. I believe it was Polybius was the one who said that the city actually burned for something like 17 days. Polybius is one of the main authors that really writes about the Third Punic War and what happened with the siege of Carthage. It's more like a sack of Carthage. It's kind of like a sack of Troy. And they say about 90% of the population of Carthage was actually wiped out, and the rest was enslaved. I forget the number of casualties, but it was something like maybe 600,000. I don't know if those are exact numbers, but some crazy number that they wiped out. And of course, the ruins today are at Tunis, and Tunisia in North Africa. And here's kind of an image of what it looks like. Basically the ruins of Carthage. There's not much left of it today. You can see, and there's a famous story, which I'm sure you've probably heard about, that the Romans plowed it under afterwards. So nothing would grow there. And then they salted the earth there, took salt and covered the whole city with salt, basically. And they don't think that is a true story. They think it's a legend that kind of, or some kind of myth that was became popular in modern times. Yeah, it's kind of weird about that. Although it looks like a lot of salt, doesn't it? But if you're looking at sand, which is there, and supposedly the area of Carthage was actually 32,000 acres of land that it may have been on, which is maybe like something like, I don't know if that's true, but it may have been something like 40, 50 square mile area we're talking about where people lived and all that. So yeah, it's doubtful about that, about that story about that. But salt was too valuable. A lot of times the Romans would pay their troops in salt. So it's likely that's probably not a true story. I think it became something that historians talked about in modern times, but it's they have done stuff like that before. I think in maybe modern times or something like that previously. But they did rebuild it later. There was like a Roman Carthage that they kind of rebuilt later. There's another city called Utica. I think it was also there in that area as well. So from there, the Roman Empire is going to expand. It's going to, get bigger and bigger in course to the, Roman world that we're going to have. As the Romans are conquering, the Carthaginian Empire, they're also conquering the rest of the Mediterranean basin. Back between the second, first centuries, they conquer most of it, maybe down to like Egypt. And the Romans kind of turned the Mediterranean Sea into this big Roman lake. It becomes, and the Romans sometimes would call it Mare Nostrum, which means our sea in Latin. And so for centuries after that, the Mediterranean Sea is pretty much controlled by the Romans up to like the 4th, 5th century CE. So for a long time, they controlled it for 500-600 years at one point. So I'm next going to get into, we're going to, of course, talk about the decline of the Republic, which kind of occurs between the 2nd and 1st centuries of BC. Of course, decline politically, the Republican aspect of it, becoming more of an empire is what eventually happens. So one of the things we're going to, of course, get to eventually, and of course, talk about is, they've got this guy named Julius Caesar, that's going to eventually come to power. He's going to take over as a dictator, and that's really going to lead to into the so-called Roman Empire. But there's like a slew of these, dictators that they've got in Rome that, of course, are well known. I'll kind of talk about some of these, but let me first talk about the decline of the Republic and what were some of the causes of why the Republic declined, more or less. Well, obviously, there were a bunch of things. One I'll kind of throw up here on the screen, but you've got at least 3 main causes. Lack of reforms, like especially with land in Rome. And they had the so-called latifundia, which are these so-called Roman plantations they have based on slaves. The senators, like the senatorial class, kind of bought a lot of these and formed these, slave plantations all over the place. And rather than smaller type farms for like the plebes and things like that could have happened more or less. And then, of course, you got the rise of opposing dictators, these political military leaders that start taking over Rome. And then don't forget all the different numerous civil wars. Civil war is really the thing that really caused the decline of the republic into an empire. What's going to happen, these so-called dictators that fight each other in civil wars will eventually become the Roman emperor, and the empire will be born. So that's something we'll kind of get into today. Now, there's this famous general that you may have heard about named Gaius Marius, who becomes really one of these first men that really is close to like what would be like these dictators that we have later. He was like this famous Roman statesman that was really one of the greatest generals at the time. At the turn of the second into the first century BC, he was Roman consul 7 times. Ridiculous. That's a lot. Of course, because he was a great general as well. And so he has a lot to do with why the Roman Republic would decline. Believe it or not, he is a cause of it, which I'll kind of explain why that is later. And a little bit about Marius. Marius was known for a lot of reforms at the time. At the turn of the second and the first century BC in Rome, and he's known for his so-called Marian reforms, which were a series of military reforms where they were trying to professionalize the Roman army, make it better than what it was during the Punic Wars. So what they did, which was very famous under him, they began to enlist any male citizen of the Roman state could join. Before it had been based on more requirements that had to do with like wealth and property, which I think before the Romans had class people, I think from like first to fifth class, on their wealth and property and all that. And why was that cause of decline? Well, what happened later was that it basically became, the armies of the Romans became mostly poor people that joined them, and they became more loyal to the general than the state. And that was a problem later. You'll see, because you'll get these rival dictators, generals fighting against each other, and it helps to kill the republic because of it. Marius also created the cohort legion, which was a type of fighting unit that was part of a Roman legion. Roman legion has 4,800 men in it, by the way. Doesn't include non-combatants that are also part of it too as well. And so a cohort had 480 legionnaires. So basically, that means that there's 10 cohorts in a legion, is what it is. So it's how they break them down, like they do modern armies today, of course, today. And then also a cohort, by the way, is broken down into what they call a century. So you take a cohort, you break it into 6 centuries. A century has 80 legionnaires in it. So 80 times 6 is 480, of course. And of course, you've heard about a centurion, right? A centurion is like a Roman officer that leads a century, basically. They even broke it down, a century down too, into what they call a contubernium, which is 8 legionnaires. So you got 10 of those in a century. So 10 times 8 is 80. So it's kind of like breaking down like almost like a squad, or something in like modern armies, of course, today. So yeah, Roman armies, like I said, were not paid by the state. They were paid by the generals, the commanders, of course, and all that. And so that's why the Romans are constantly fighting everybody, trying to conquer territory, because they're trying to get money, booty, off these wars, and to pay all their soldiers, and so on. By the way, the average year terms of soldiers in the Roman army, 16 years for just, average soldiers that fought in the war. Then you had reserve, and then cavalrymen, it was like 10 years that they fought as well in the wars. Any kind of conflicts, I guess, also as well, if they lived that long, of course, that kind of thing. So hard life as a soldier, by the way. But like I said, a lot of the actual legionnaires were usually from the lower classes. A lot of officers were from the upper classes, usually, were wealthier, usually. There's also this other general they have too, and statesman that came along too, which was Cornelius Sulla. He was also very important too, as well. He was a rival statesman to Marius, who kind of starts being important in the 80s BC. And because these two kind of, becoming big rivals, they eventually come to open civil war. So you get what they call Sulla's Civil War, which breaks out in 88 BC, which will last 6-7 years. And basically, both those two men struggled to take control of Rome, like who would be in power, and all of that. And if you know what happened, Sulla eventually exiled Marius from Rome, exiled him. And then what happened was Sulla eventually marched his forces into Rome, which nobody had ever really done before. And just seized power and took control of it, with weapons. Because usually they'd have these victory marches to the city, they wouldn't be like really armed and all that. But in this case, of course, they would. And so Sulla would take over as like a dictator. And one thing that Sulla's kind of known for is reviving the dictatorship in Rome, which is kind of similar to the Greek tyrant that we talked about, the tyranny we discussed with them as well. But the only thing about that was that, Sulla would step down. He would retire, and wouldn't, stay permanently as a dictator. That's different with Julius Caesar later. Julius Caesar tries to stay permanently dictator, and that's what eventually leads into, of course, a civil war that breaks out later. And that's the next thing we got to talk about, of course, which is famous, which, we get into the, three-headed monster, of the so-called first triumvirate. They sometimes call it that, the so-called three-headed monster that you got that comes in. And after Sulla would retire, you'd have this three-man dictatorship that would take over Rome, 60 BC, which lasts about 7 years, from 60 to 53 BC. You've got these three powerful men that come in and take over: Caesar, Crassus, and of course Pompey, which I'll put their full names on the screen. Gnaeus Pompey, and of course they call Gnaeus Pompeianus Magnus, which means, by the way, Pompey the Great is his name. They called him it. It's a nickname. So he's a great general and all that, supposedly. Then Marcus Licinius Crassus, that's his full name. And then you have Gaius Julius Caesar, of course, the third guy in that list. Caesar, of course, was very popular. Of course, he came from like a family that's not as prestigious, which was the Julian family. But Crassus was very wealthy. You can see he came from an equestrian background that we talked about, the equites. Very wealthy man, owned a lot of land. They say Crassus would be like a billionaire. He'd be like Bill Gates back then in wealth. And Pompey was also wealthy, but he was known for having a good military reputation as a general, of course, overall. Talk a little bit about the two different sides. Pompey, by the way, was and Crassus were actually these Roman generals that had backed Sulla in the Civil War I talked about. So they were on his side, basically, in the war. Then Julius Caesar was on Marius's side. The reason why was Marius was basically his uncle. He had basically married one of Julius Caesar's aunts, and so he was kind of connected with him because of that. With that, so yeah, that's something that's true about that. And then Pompey and Crassus, if you know about them, they also became household names because of the fact that they were involved in putting down the famous Spartacus revolt. You probably heard about this. That was fought in the early 1st century BC in Italy, often called the so-called Third Servile War. And the Spartacus revolt was this bloody slave revolt involving a man named Spartacus. You've heard of him, and of course, made movies out of him and TV shows, who was a Thracian soldier who was an ex-gladiator at a school in Capua, which was in southern Italy. And he rebelled against the Romans. And so the Romans sent numerous armies to fight against Spartacus, but he crushed their armies. It was actually pretty good as a general. But eventually what happened was the two generals, Pompey and Crassus, eventually crushed his forces. And I think they say a bunch of his forces were actually crucified, especially along the Appian Way between Capua and Rome. So now, of course, the other famous, of course, the guy we're going to get more into, of course, is Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, will be the one who becomes really the one that's more famous than those other two men, which are right there. Caesar was known for a lot of things. He was a great statesman and reformer. He did reform the state a little bit when he was kind of like a ruler. He was a great Roman general. And then, as you know, he became, very famous as a dictator later. He is, by the way, considered to be one of Rome's greatest generals. He is considered, by the way, to be one of the greatest generals in history. So like maybe you can put him up top 10, ancient times or whatever as a general. So there he is right there, Julius Caesar. And Caesar became famous, by the way, for a series of wars that were known as the Gallic Wars, which were fought in the 50s BC. He was given this commission to control and governorship of what is called Gaul, which is north of Italy. It was now France. And so he led legions into Gaul, which is what the Romans called it, and conquered it. Who were the Gauls? The Gauls were like these Celtic-type peoples, similar to peoples like in Britain. And it was a very bloody conflict. I think they say close to 1 million people were killed in the so-called Gallic Wars. Here's kind of a map of Europe, but you can see area he conquered was right here in France, between Italy and Spain. Huge area that he conquered right here. And when he was there, he did a few other things that's well known. Julius Caesar, he also crossed into what is Germany. He actually built a bridge across the Rhine River, partially invaded Germany, which the Romans weren't too successful invading Germany, by the way. And then the other thing he did, of course, was he also invaded what is Britain twice, between 55 to 54 BC. He did it twice, where he crossed the English Channel also as well. He was also a writer. He had at least one book that he wrote the majority of, which is called the Commentaries on the Gallic Wars, which you see right here, which was kind of written as he was fighting the campaigns and all that. They say he wrote 7 of the 8 books that were in it. So he was kind of a decent writer, and he was also a really, really great orator, great speaker, Julius Caesar. He was also a big ladies' man. He had a lot of women, and that kind of adored him, and all that. And Caesar was kind of like a Donald Trump. He was kind of like this guy people liked or hated. Kind of like Napoleon, too, was a guy people liked and hated and things like that. So people had different opinions about him, positive or negative, more or less. The campaigns of Julius Caesar made him very famous, by the way. He became a household name. The plebes just, adored him. They thought he was just the greatest thing ever. And the man of the people, the hero to them. And so if you know about Rome, Rome had these 2 rival factions that were called the Populeres and the Optimates. The Populeres were like these mostly just wealthier people that supported the plebes. And your Optimates were your wealthy people that supported the wealthy people, So it's kind of like almost like Democrat and Republican, but they weren't political parties. They were just these rival factions that were in the Roman Senate. And Caesar was a big supporter of the Popularis side, and all that. What eventually kills off, of course, the Republic? Well, one of the things that's going to occur, of course, to lead to this, which we'll be talking about more probably after the spring break, really, is that the first triumvirate is going to break up. That's one of the things that's going to occur. That's going to eventually occur. And it's caused by the fact that Marcus Crassus, he's kind of getting jealous that, Caesar's getting all these victories in Gaul, in France. And so he wants to do his thing as well. And so he goes and fights the Parthian Empire, which is in the east, like close to Turkey and Syria and all that. He gets killed in battle, 53. So it leaves 2 men left to fight each other out, with his 2 rivals. You've got Caesar and Pompey at that point. And so Pompey, apparently, who's more this man that's more of an optimate, he's backed by the Roman Senate. They kind of want him to be like sole ruler of Rome. The Senate's kind of is also jealous of Caesar too, his growing power, his popularity with the Roman people. They want his army disbanded right away. And so Caesar decides to make a decision like what he's going to do. He either has to give up his army or he's got to fight him. And so what happens eventually with Julius Caesar, as you know, is he takes his armies, to what is basically northern Italy, and he crosses into Italy, which he wasn't supposed to do. And so this becomes very famous. This is, of course, known as the so-called crossing of the Rubicon in January of 49 BC. And it actually initiates the so-called Caesar's Civil War that occurs over a period of like 4 or 5 years from 49 to 45 BC. And if you know the famous quote of Julius Caesar, he said famously at the River Rubicon, he said, "The die is cast." And here's the Latin, alea jacta est, of course. And what did he meant by that? He meant the fact that he realized that he was taking a chance here by crossing the Rubicon. His fate, could be good or bad. So he realized that there's no going back once I cross that river. And so it's going to lead to civil war, the so-called Caesar Civil War that will occur. We'll, of course, talk about this later, but the Caesar Civil War is going to be one of the major conflicts that eventually leads into the establishment of the Roman Empire. Caesar will not be the first emperor, as you know, but he's going to be the dictator that kind of is the prototype for the Roman emperors later. Of course, we will be talking about the rise of Octavian, his grandnephew, that'll kind of seize power after the death of Caesar, which you kind of see that's that painting behind me, the death of Caesar. Can't quite see it, but we'll kind of talk about that later, how Caesar, conquers, most of the Republic. He's eventually murdered in the Roman Senate. And of course, that will lead into, of course, Octavian eventually coming to power as the first Roman emperor. So we'll kind of get in later and talk about the beginning of the Roman Empire in my lecture. But as you know, we have spring break coming up, of course, next week. I think it starts Friday, actually. I think it's Good Friday. It starts on right. So we've got Friday this week off, and then next week, of course, also as well. So that's going to be pretty much it for today. Don't forget, though, you do have an assignment that's going to be due. It is kind of due during the spring break, which is that second exam on the Greeks and Alexander the Great. So don't forget about that. Be thinking also about your book report. You're trying to get that wrapped up for April coming up because, tomorrow is the first day of April. April Fool's Day, huh? Anyway, so yes, don't forget about that. Of course, about that big assignment you've got coming up later. So that's it for today. Hope everyone has, great weekend coming up. And of course, spring break, holiday. And of course, I'll see you later, of course, after the spring break. So don't forget too, if you have any questions, about this lecture or any other previous lecture, let me know through my channel more or less. So see you later. Y'all take care, of course.